Learn Meet Light Meet Max සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න. Work and Learn Meet Light Meet Max සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න.
දැන් Signal Herbal 99ක් විශ්වවිද්‍යාල සමග සටන් කරයි.
In your headlines tonight, legislative approval. Sri Lanka's parliament endorses proclamation of state of emergency on July 17th by a majority vote of 57. Towards rescue, Sri Lanka must discuss debt restructuring with China proactively as the process for the island's 17th extended facility progresses. Cooperation. US Ambassador to Sri Lanka Julie Chung and President Ranil Wickremesinghe discuss how the US and Sri Lanka can work together to navigate toward a brighter future. Growth prospects. The IMF slashes global growth forecasts, warns risks are overwhelmingly tilted to the downside, while Bangladesh asks IMF to start negotiations for a 4.5 billion loan.
විම්දියර මිලිලීටර් 100 ස්මාර්ට් පැක් එක රුපියල් 85ට දැන් වෙළඳ පොලේ.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
And a warm welcome. Joining you tonight on First at 9, I am Indivari Amuatta, taking you to tonight's top story. In Parliament, the proclamation on state of emergency declared on the 17th of July by the then acting president under the Public Security Ordinance was approved by a majority vote of 57 today. 120 members of Parliament voted in favour while 63 voted against. In the meantime, Chairman of United National Party Vajra Abewardena was sworn in as a Member of Parliament to fill the seat left vacant following the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe as the President. Parliament convened today for the first time after voting Ranil Wickremesinghe to the office of President last week. Today's sitting commenced at 10 a.m. under a new Prime Minister and a new cabinet also in office. Firstly, Speaker Mahindayapa Abewardena announced that Minister of Education Dr. Susil Premajayantha has been appointed as the new leader of the House and Minister of Housing and Urban Development Prasanna Ranatunga reappointed as the Chief Government Whip. Prior to parliamentary proceedings, UNP Chairman Vajra Abewardena took oaths as the Member of Parliament before Speaker Mahindayapa Abewardena to fill the seat left vacant following the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe as President. Later, the topic of the proclamation of state of emergency on July 17th by the then acting President Ranil Wickremesinghe was debated at the chamber.
අගමැතිතුමාගේ ගෙගිනි තිබ්බා. එතුමාගේ ගෙදර තිබුණු බුදු පිළිම. ඒවටත් හානි කළා. හැබැයි දැන් මේක තුල සැකයක් එනවා. LTT එකේ සෙවණැලි තිබෙනවද? පාස්කු ප්‍රහාරයේ සෙවණැලි තිබෙනවද? විදේශ බලවේගවල කවුරු හරි මෙතන ඉන්නවද? රූපවාහිනී සංස්ථාවට අතුල් වෙලා රාජ්‍ය දේපලක් අතුල් වෙලා රූපවාහිනී විකාශනය නවත්තලා සම්බන්ධ වෙච්ච අය කොහෙද විදේශගත වෙන්න ගියා. ගුවන් යානයේදී අත්අඩංගුවට ගත්තා. මෙන්න මේව නිසා තමයි මේ හදිසි නීති අවශ්‍ය වෙලා තියෙන්නේ.
සාමකාමී අරගලු කරුවන් කියන කාණ්ඩායම ඉදිරියට දාගෙන මේකේ සම්පූර්ණ මෙහෙයුමේ පාතාලයේ කුඩුකාරයෝ ඒ වගේම මංකොල්ලකාරයෝ සමහර අරගලු කරුවන් ප්‍රකාශ කරලා තිබුණා ප්‍රභාකරන් හොඳයි කියලා. නාගරික සංවර්ධන අමාත්‍යවරයා වශයෙන් මම මේ ගරු සභාවේ අවධානය යොමු කරන්න කැමතියි. ජනාධිපති ලේකම් කාර්යාලයට යාපත උද්ඝෝෂණ පැවැත්වීමේ ස්ථානය ලෙස නම් කර ඇති භූමිය ඒ සඳහා කිසිදු ආකාරයකින් සුදුසු ස්ථානයක් නොවන බව තහවුරු වී තියෙනවා. එබැවින් වහාම ක්‍රියාත්මක පරිදි ස්ථානය එතනින් ඉවත් කර ඒ සඳහා වෙනත් විකල්ප සුදුසු ස්ථානයක් ලබා දිය යුතුයි කියලා මම විශ්වාස කරනවා.
මේ ත්‍රස්තවාදයක් ගැන කතා කරලා ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වයේ ආරම්භ වුණේ අරලියගහ මන්දිරේ මහින්ද රාජපක්ෂ මැතිතුමාගේ සමුගැනීමත් සමග බව කරුණා කරලා අමතක කරන්න එපා. රාජ්‍ය ත්‍රස්තවාදයේ ක්‍රියාත්මක කරා. එහෙව් දේවල් කරලා ඔබතුමන්ලා හිතනවද අපි ආණ්ඩු කරන්න එනවා කියලා?
the emergency regulations that we are debating today, that were imposed on the 18th of July, are unique for two specific reasons. One is that it includes measures that are draconian and most repressive in ways that it has never been before. For instance, it allows for a person to be arrested even by the military to be kept up to 72 hours. I do not think this has happened before. It has vested within the president powers which are largely unchecked. For 72 hours, this person need not be presented before a court, need not be presented to the police. Powers that have been delegated to the police and to the military have expanded exponentially. For example, simple offences now are described as high crimes and can include imprisonment up to 20 years or even life imprisonment. What is necessary is not to just look at the imposition of emergency regulations, but what has been gazetted under this particular emergency regulations. The measures that have been taken are unprecedented. And it's unprecedented for a second reason, that these measures were imposed by a president who was an acting president at the time, who was unelected. In general, when emergency regulations are declared, there's an understanding that there should be specific circumstances, that there is some deep threat to national security or to public security. It is under those circumstances that emergency regulations are usually imposed. But what are the conditions under which these emergency regulations have been imposed? We know that the protests that people have risen primarily due to deep economic distress that people are undergoing. Most of the protests that started with the economic conditions that people have had to undergo, that people have been distressed by. How those kinds of protests can be described as a threat to national security and threat to public security is something that needs to be considered.
සැප්තැම්බර් මාසේ වෙනකොට මේ ඉන්දියානු ණය හෝ වෙනත් පැත්තකින් මේ ණය ලැබුණ නැත්නම් මේ රට ඉතාමත්ම භයානක අඳුරු අගාධයකට යනවා විතරක් නෙවෙයි. ඔය අපි දැකපු අප්‍රේල් 9 මැයි 9 ජූනි 9 ජූලි 9 සතියෙන් සතිය එන්න පුළුවන් ඉදිරි කාලෙදී අපි ඒක මතක තබා ගත යුතුයි. තුවක්කුවෙන් මර්ධනයෙන් වෙඩි තබලා මේ ප්‍රශ්නේ යටපත් කරන්න හදනවා නම් මම නම් විරුද්ධයි මේ හසි නීතියට.
This is the third attempt in 3 months to promulgate a state of emergency. We have not seen anything like this in the past. Now, what is the cause for this? Why is a state of emergency necessary today? We've gone through a stormy period from April till July. There were attempts to promulgate emergency which failed. Now, after the new president has taken over, a state of emergency is being declared. What for? He became president on account of this protest. If not for this protest, he won't be president today.
අපිත් මේ හදිසි නීති කැමැත්තෙන් ගේන්නේ නැහැ. අද අලුත් ආණ්ඩුවේ මේ පළවෙනි යෝජනාව විදියට සතුටින් නෙමෙයි මේක මේ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවට ඉදිරිපත් කරේ. හැබැයි අපි කවුරුත් පිළිගන්න ඕන නීතියේ ආධිපත්‍ය බිඳ හැලුනොත් ඔබතුමන්ලා විපක්ෂයේද අපි ආණ්ඩු පක්ෂයේද කියන එක වැදගත් නැහැ. කාගේවත් ජීවිතවලට අපිට ආරක්ෂාව දෙන්න බෑ. ඒක නිසා මේක ඉතාමත්ම සංවේදී කාරණයක්. මේ රටේ ජාතික අවශ්‍යතාවයක් විදියට අපි කටයුතු කරන්න ඕන.
Following the debate, a vote was called in Parliament seeking approval of the House for the proclamation of the state of emergency. State of emergency was thereby approved by a majority of 57 votes, with 120 members voting in favour and 63 voting against.
යෝජනාවට පක්ෂ ඡන්ද 120යි විපක්ෂව ඡන්ද 63යි. යෝජනාව සම්මතයි.
Prime Minister Dinesh Gunawardena called on all parliamentarians representing political parties in the opposition to join hands with government in order to overcome the challenges in the country. In his maiden speech in Parliament as Prime Minister, Dinesh Gunawardena pledged to Parliament that necessary constitutional reforms will take place as promised, such as the establishment of executive committees.
අපේ මූල්‍ය අර්බුදයත් අපේ ආර්ථික අර්බුදයත් ඉතාම උත්සන්න තත්වයකට පරිවර්තනය වුණා. එයට මුහුණ දීම සඳහා වූ ක්‍රියාමාර්ගයේදී මහජනතාවගේ පැත්තෙනොත් දැවැන්ත මහජන උද්ඝෝෂණ ව්‍යාපාර හා බලපෑමක් ඇති වුණා. එය වෙනස් කිරීම සඳහා දේශපාලන ක්‍රියාදහමය දේශපාලන යාන්ත්‍රණය ආණ්ඩු ක්‍රම ව්‍යවස්ථාව තුළ වෙනස් කිරීමේ කාර්යයට අපේ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ දෙපාර්ශ්වයේම අදහස් රාශියක් ඉදිරිපත් කළා. යම් එකඟතාවයකට පැමිණිය හැකි ක්‍රියාමාර්ග හා ව්‍යවස්ථා සංශෝධනයන්ට අපි පිවිසෙන්නට බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන ක්‍රියාදහමේ ආරම්භ කරලා තිබෙනවා. ඒ අපි ප්‍රතිඥා දෙනවා පාර්ලිමේන්තුවට. ඒ වගේම
අපේ ආණ්ඩු ක්‍රමය හා පාර්ලිමේන්තුව තුළ විධායක කාරක සභා ක්‍රමය ඇති කරන්න අපි ප්‍රතිඥා දෙනවා. ඒ වහාම ඇති කිරීම සඳහා වූ අවශ්‍ය ස්ථාවර නියෝගයන් මාර්ගයෙන් පියවර ගැනීමට ආණ්ඩුව කැපවී තිබෙන බව ජනාධිපතිතුමා විසින්ද ඒ සඳහා අවශ්‍ය කෙටුම්පතක්ද ඉදිරිපත් කිරිය සාකච්ඡා කරන්න පුළුවන්කමට අද අපි පෙළඹෙනවා. විධායක කාරක සභා ක්‍රමයට පරිවර්තනය කිරීම සඳහා උත්සාහය වැදගත් කර්තව්‍යයක් ඉටු කරන්න පුළුවන් වෙයි කියලා අපි හිතනවා. හැම මන්ත්‍රීවරයෙක්ටම තමන් නියෝජනය කරන කාරක සභාවේ කටයුතු කරන්න පුළුවන්කම ඇතිවීමෙන් ජාතික වශයෙන් තිබෙන අභියෝග, ජාතික වශයෙන් තිබෙන අවශ්‍ය සංවර්ධන කටයුතු, ඒ වගේම රටට ඵලදායී ලෙස ප්‍රයෝජනයට ගත හැකි අනපනත් සම්මත කිරීම එකඟතාවයකින් යුතුව කටයුතු කරන්න පුළුවන්කම ලැබෙනවා. අපේ කර්මාන්ත ශේත්‍රයට ආයෝජකයන් ගෙන්වා ගැනීම සඳහා අපි රජය හැටියට ඒ පියවරවන් වලට ආයෝජකයන්ට ආරාධනය කරනවා. රජය මහජන විරෝධතාවයන්ට සවන් දෙන්න සූදානම්. ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී විරෝධතාවයන්ට සවන් දෙන්න සූදානම්. නමුත් ත්‍රස්තවාදීව කටයුතු කිරීම අපට පිළිගන්න බෑ. මේ මූල්‍ය ආර්ථික අර්බුදයෙන් ගොඩේමක් අපේ මිත්‍ර රටවල් අපිත් එක්ක කටයුතු කරන ජාත්‍යන්තර සංවිධාන සමග මිත්‍රත්වයෙන් මේ අර්බුදයේ විශේෂ වීම සඳහා අපි කාගෙත් සහාය බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන බව සඳහන් කරමින් ඉදිරි වෙනස්කම් සඳහා කටයුතු කරන රජය හැටියට රජය සමග අත්වැල් බැඳගෙන මේ අභියෝගයක් ජය ගන්න අපි විරුද්ධ පක්ෂයේ සෑම දේශපාලන පක්ෂයකටම මන්ත්‍රීවරුන්ට ආරාධනය කර සිටිනවා. මේ වෙනස්කම් පාර්ලිමේන්තුව තුළ, මේ වෙනස්කම් ආණ්ඩු ක්‍රමය තුළ, මේ වෙනස්කම් ආර්ථික ශාස්ත්‍රය තුළ ඇති කළ ඉදිරියට ගමන් කරමු.
How long can former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa remain in Singapore? Reports from the city-state after this break.
Big 3.
Welcome back to the news. Singapore has permitted former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to remain in the country for an additional 14 days. Straits Times reported today that his pass to the city-state will now expire on the 11th of August. Former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was issued a 14-day visit pass when he arrived at the Changi airport in Singapore from the Maldives on the 14th of July. Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said on the 14th that Rajapaksa had not asked for asylum and neither had the city-state granted asylum to him. The ministry added that Singapore generally does not grant requests for asylum. Cabinet spokesperson Dr. Bandula Gunawardena meanwhile said yesterday at the Cabinet media briefing that former President Gotabaya is expected to return to Sri Lanka from Singapore. US Ambassador to Sri Lanka Julie Chang and President Ranil Wickremesinghe have discussed how both countries can work together to navigate towards a bright future. The discussion took place this morning at the Presidential Secretariat when the US Ambassador in Colombo called on the President. Meanwhile, the US Ambassador, commenting on the meeting with the President on Twitter, said President Ranil Wickremesinghe takes office at a time when Sri Lanka stands at crossroads. The US envoy said that they discussed how Sri Lanka arrived at this point of economic and political crisis and how the US and Sri Lanka can work together to navigate towards a brighter future for all. Chang went on to say that the two countries' relationships will flourish in a Sri Lanka that embraces good governance, respects human rights and listens to the aspirations of the people. Indian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka Gopal Bagle said India is now planning to invest heavily in newer sectors in Sri Lanka through both private and public sector. In a recent interview with an Indian media outlet, the Indian envoy said New Delhi will work with Sri Lanka both at the functional level and as well as political to facilitate talks for a bailout package with the IMF. In an interview to Indian online newspaper The Print, Indian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka Gopal Bagle said India is now planning to invest heavily in newer sectors in Sri Lanka through both their private and public enterprises after helping Sri Lanka with an unprecedented assistance of around $4 billion since January as the island plunged into deeper economic crisis. According to the Indian envoy, the sectors India will focus on include renewable energy, hydrocarbons, ports and infrastructure and IT among others. Both countries are also looking at signing the long-pending economic and technology cooperation agreement. The top Indian diplomat in Colombo said New Delhi will now work with the new government in Sri Lanka both at functional as well as political levels to facilitate talks for a bailout package by the International Monetary Fund for Sri Lanka, which got stuck earlier as the situation worsened in the island. Barclay went on to say that Sri Lanka is now trying to come back to normal levels of functioning and the economy will benefit from more investments, and as a result they are now looking at bringing in more investments into the island nation. The Supreme Court today extended the travel ban on former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa and former Minister Basil Rajapaksa until the 2nd of August as they were named as respondents in a case filed over the economic crisis here in the island. A motion was filed on the 13th of July seeking an order prohibiting former Prime Minister and the former Minister of Finance as well as Central Bank Governor and several others from leaving the country.
The motion was submitted in relation to a fundamental rights petition filed by the former chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce Chandra Jayaratne, requesting that an investigation be ordered against the individuals responsible for the current economic crisis of the country. Accordingly, the FR petition was taken up before a 5-member judge consisting of Chief Justice Jayantha Jayasuriya and Supreme Court Justices LTB Dehideniya and Buhane Kaluvihare, Priyantha Jayawardena and Vijit Malalgoda. When the petition was taken up today, the judge bench headed by the Chief Justice ordered to extend the travel ban on the former Prime Minister and the former Finance Minister until 2nd of August. Meanwhile, Supreme Court ordered to discharge President Ranil Wickremesinghe from proceedings of the petition filed over the economic crisis in which he is named as a respondent. The order was issued by a 5-member Supreme Court bench presided over by Chief Justice Jayantha Jayasuriya. President's counsel Chandaka Jayasundara, who appeared for the petitioners, requested the court to release President Wickremesinghe from court proceedings, stating that the petitioners do not seek relief against him although he is named as a respondent in the petition.
The police seek information on suspects in connection with the torching of President Ranil Wickremesinghe's private residence in Colombo 3. Police say some of the suspects are involved in the incident of damaging and torching the private residence of Ranil Wickremesinghe on the 9th July during the mass protests have been identified. The suspects were identified after a criminal investigation department probe. Police now seek public support in arresting the identified suspects. Moreover, police have requested the public to provide any information pertaining to these suspects through telephone to the numbers appearing on your screen. Minister of Power and Energy Kanchana Vijayasekara says 4 million users have registered with the National Fuel Pass as at 9 p.m. yesterday. Minister Vijayasekara tweeted that 299 fuel stations of the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation and 34 of Lanka Indian Oil Company fully adopted and tested the QR system yesterday to complete 92,845 transactions. In the meantime, registrations of three-wheelers was conducted at all police stations across the island. According to police, registrations were done after checking documents such as vehicle registration certificate, revenue license and the QR code obtained under the National Fuel Pass system. The filling stations near the residence of the registered owners of three-wheelers will be designated for him to obtain fuel, and the maximum number of three-wheelers directed to one fuel station will be limited to 250. According to the subject minister, all three-wheelers across the island needs to have themselves registered with police before the 31st of this month. Now, the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka approved power interruptions of 3 hours for tomorrow. The 3-hour power interruption to groups M, N or XYZ will be scheduled between 5:30 a.m. and 8:50 a.m. Group CC will have 2 hours and 30 minutes of scheduled power cuts between 6 a.m. and 8:50 a.m. Groups A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W will have power interrupted for 1 hour and 40 minutes between 1 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. and again 1 hour and 2 minutes, or rather 20 minutes between 6 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. Taking you to business news, the main index of the Colombo Stock Exchange closed the day flat, with traders taking a subdued note as investors continue to remain sidelined. Now, the index spiked by over 50 points within the first few minutes of trading and later plunged down on the back of profit-taking in selected counters. Subsequently, as selling pressure eased, index closed down marginally at 7,762, losing 3 points. Turnover improved to 1 billion rupees, largely led by food, beverage and tobacco sector, according to making a contribution of 56%. High net worth and foreign investor participation was observed during today's session. Foreign investors also displayed robust participation and turned net buyers while recording net inflow of 282.3 million rupees. International Monetary Fund says Sri Lanka should kick off debt restructuring talks with bilateral lender China, while the government seeks a financing loan from the multilateral funding agency. Director of the IMF's Asia and Pacific Department, Krishna Srinivasan, told Reuters in an interview that China is a big creditor and Sri Lanka has to engage proactively with it on a debt restructuring. Sri Lanka owes Beijing some $6.5 billion in financing, including development bank loans and a central bank swap. IMF's Asia Pacific Department Chief Krishna Srinivasan has said that Sri Lanka must engage with creditors, both private and official bilateral, on a debt workout to ensure debt sustainability is restored. He also pointed out that technical talks on a new IMF program are ongoing with both officials from the Finance Ministry and the Central Bank. Sri Lanka requested an IMF rescue plan to overcome the worst economic crisis since independence after defaulting on overseas debt earlier this year. The IMF's Asia Pacific director has said that there are some areas where both parties should make further progress, but had declined to specify the top reforms Sri Lanka should address in order to reach an agreement. An extended fund facility program formed the Washington-based fund, which would be its 17th plan for Sri Lanka, requires the economy to make structural economic reforms. Srinivasan also said the fund is advising countries to spend more in alleviating the impact on the poor and vulnerable, but keeping budget neutral by reducing expenditure elsewhere or raising revenues where feasible. Now, Bangladesh has asked the International Monetary Fund to start negotiations on a $4.5 billion loan for balance of payments and budget assistance, becoming the latest South Asian nation to ask for assistance as costlier oil eats into the region's foreign exchange stockpiles. Bangladeshi Finance Minister was quoted as saying the economy was, however, in no way in trouble. Minister A.H.M. Mushtaq Kamal said he did not specify any amount in a letter he sent to the IMF. On Sunday, the multilateral lender has confirmed receipt of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's government's request, aiding that the IMF stands ready to support the Bangladeshi nation, and the staff will engage with authorities on the program design. The request is under the IMF's new Resilience and Sustainability Facility to help low and middle-income countries address long-term challenges, including those related to climate change and pandemic preparedness. Bangladesh has sought the loan to meet any future needs, but it doesn't face any economic crisis as yet. The International Monetary Fund slashed its global growth forecasts and raised its projections for inflation, warning that the risks to the economic outlook of the world are overwhelmingly tilted to the downside. The downgraded estimates come as the world grapples with the bailout and fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, prolonged disruptions caused by the coronavirus pandemic and rapidly tightening financial conditions, with central banks seeking to contain soaring prices. The fund now expects growth in gross domestic product to slow to 3.2% in 2022, down 0.4 percentage points from its April estimate and roughly half the pace of last year's expansion. In 2023, global growth is set to weaken further to 2.9% just 3 months ago. That estimate was 0.7 percentage points higher. Global inflation is likely to intensify, with the IMF raising its forecast for this year and next by nearly a full percentage point to 8.3% and 5.7% respectively. The multilateral lender said the economic outlook had become much more gloomy and extraordinarily uncertain, with inflation at historic peaks and challenges to growth increasing. And that's all from us tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.